Okay, in this video I'm going to cover the calibration of the OBX voice cards and voice motherboard. I'm going to assume here that you've calibrated the DAC so that your CVs are all accurate. This is somewhat specific to the Abstrakt Instruments voice cards and voice card motherboards, but most of it is applicable to any OBX, and it may be useful. So first what we're going to do is we're going to put the unit into manual mode. I'm going to listen to just oscillator 1. I like to use the saw to tune against. Frequency at maximum, resonance at minimum, and envelope modulation depth at minimum. Also make sure you have no modulation go into the VCO or VCF from the LFO. You may want to put volume around 3/4 so that the output VCAs are at a nice healthy level but not distorting like they do. Of course, you'll need to set the master tune to the center position and the oscillator to detune to the center position. You're going to want to put your unit into test mode. Test 1 switch should be in the down position. This disables the key CV bias CVs, the calibration CVs for each voice, so that we can calibrate it with all the CVs at mid-scale. And then once we calibrate it without auto-tune, we fire up the auto-tune, and there's plenty of room for it to do its thing and auto-tune the voices. The 8-position dip switch will enable the voices individually. So voices 1 through 8 on the bottom shelf, you start at 1, 2, 3, 4. The top shelf, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You can enable and disable any one of them. So when I start this calibration for this first VCO, I am going to enable voice 1 only. Of course, there's many different ways to calibrate the machine and many different methods of isolating your voices for comparison against other voices or against reference tones, etc. Okay, so again, some old units may have 3 slide switches like these here. They work in a binary fashion, so they allow you to enable between 1 and 8 voices. Okay, so now that we're ready to go, again, we've got cutoff at maximum, filter resonance at minimum, no filter envelope modulation depth, and no LFO modulation to either the filter or the VCO. Also to note, the pan pots are useful. Usually when you calibrate, you'll be monitoring one of the outputs, either the left or the right, and sometimes the pan pots can be useful for isolating voices from one another. Okay, so the way I like to do it is, like I said, I've got the settings as I noted before. I put the unit into normal poly mode. I've isolated voice 1. You can see I'll just repeatedly be playing voice 1. And since this is a fresh, uncalibrated board, I'm going to begin by calibrating VCO1 of each card against a reference tone, a reference A440 saw wave. Then I'll go back and tune VCO2 of each board against its own VCO1. Of course, there's many ways to do this. You could tune VCO1 of the first board and then try to tune all the VCOs against that initial VCO. Here, with the multi-turn trimmers, it's going to be so accurate that it's really not important on which method you choose. So we're going to use the method that I'm showing here. Well, before I start my reference tone, I'll mention that I like to calibrate VCOs by setting the initial frequency at the higher octave and then the scale at the lower octave. So per the OBX service manual, they call low C C0. So C0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and C5 at the high end of the board. So I'm going to do the initial tune at A3 and the width against A0. And then when I get done doing that a few times, I'll jump up to A4 and set the high frequency. Okay, now I like to monitor in mono the reference tone or the reference VCO versus the VCO I'm calibrating, because you can really hear the oscillators beating against each other. Okay, so here I'm going to start the tone. Okay. High frequency. It's already dead on. Now I'm going to enable voice 2. I'm going to make sure voice 2 is panned to the side that I'm monitoring. Now I'm going to set the width. High frequency. Same thing, voice 3. A0. A4. Dead on. Okay, I can get them very close, especially with the 25-turn trim pots. The Oberheim engineers, when they originally designed the voice boards, they really did spend time tweaking the resistors of the various calibrations so that they're pretty much at the midpoint. If you have your brand new trim pots, and they're pretty much towards the center position, so it's easy to calibrate. Although much easier with the multi-turns than the inexpensive single-turn trimmers. So I just tuned them pretty perfectly. It's really not necessary, because as soon as I move this machine in another environment, or I close the lid for another half an hour or whatever, they're going to drift a little bit. But I can't help but try to make it perfect while I'm here, and then when I enable auto-tune, they'll be perfect. Now I could have used a reference tone only for VCO 1, and then calibrated them all against oscillator 1 of voice card 1. It's up to you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to calibrate oscillator 2 of each card to its own oscillator 1. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enable voice 1 again. I'm going to go back up to the top panel. I'm going to turn VCO 2 on, set them both to saw wave, which should work well. You can really hear the beating. Back to A3. High frequency. Voice 2. synced. Now A4 for high frequency adjustment. Okay, voice 3. One more. It's pretty much perfect already. And there we have it. 4 voices calibrated. Put that sucker in unison. No auto-tune. Next, we're going to calibrate the pulse width adjustment for each oscillator. So for pulse width, just make sure you have your pulse width control at the minimum position, which will be where you adjust for 50% pulse width. Turn on the pulse for your 2 waveforms. What I'm going to do is enable oscillator 1 and adjust the pulse width of oscillator 1 for each voice card, and then I'm going to go back and I'll do it for oscillator 2. Okay, so I'm going to stay in poly mode so I can cycle through voices, and I will disable all the voices except one. There's many ways to do this. I like to disable the other voices from the mix because the output mixer on the OBX, the final stage, is pretty dirty, and you can get a cleaner signal if you keep the signal level low and you're monitoring simply one voice at a time and not relying on the pans to defeat the other voices. It's really not that important, but it's the way I like to do it. So here we go. Now we can hear I've got a very clean pulse. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to hook up the ground probe to a ground point. I prefer to use the lead from the Temcos. The bottom lead is ground. It's easy to remember. And you're going to hook up to the top lead of R41, which is the pulse output, the raw output from the pulse. And I like to set my oscilloscope to 1 millisecond divisions, and I like to calibrate at note G1, which is basically 100 hertz. 100 hertz will give you a period of just about 10 milliseconds. So when you have a visual cue on the scope, a nice division on the scope to look for without having to set the scope up to measure the period or anything like that, because ultimately your ears, when you hear that hollow sound and that buzzing goes away, your ears are going to be the cue. I generally don't even use the oscilloscope when adjusting pulse width. So here we go. This one here was pretty darn close right out of the box. You hear it getting buzzy. hollow, hollow, fuzzy, hollow, done. Okay, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna enable voice 2. Get a nice clean pulse. Turn that one up. That one was pretty close too. A little buzzy. Fuzzy. Hollow. Done deal. Voice 3. Fuzzy. Hollow. Right there. You can also adjust the resonance and the cutoff to kind of give you a bit of a sweet spot to listen to. Okay, so there's third one, and now I'm going to go to R41 on the fourth voice, and I'm going to enable voice 4. And here we go again. Again, pulse width adjustment is pretty easy, especially with 25 turn trimmers. You can really dial it in. That's it right there, bam. You can see here 50% pulse width. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I am going to turn on oscillator 2, and I'm going to go backwards. And on this time, we're going to monitor the right side pin of R77, which is the pulse output of oscillator 2. And here we go. Hollow, fuzzy, hollow, hollow. Okay. Next voice, I've got to enable that voice. You don't have to go through and enable and disable the voices if you want to just cycle through them, but depends on what's easier for you. Getting close. There it is. Easy as that. Here we go. Voice 3. Or voice 2, I'm sorry. Voice card 2. Okay. There it is. I'm going to move it right back to that place, but I will overshoot it just for kicks. And the last voice. Back to voice card 1. There it is. Bam. Okay. Now we're done here. If we turn on all the voices, we can... Okay. That sounds a little off. I'm going to go back and take a quick look at voice 4 again. VCO2 of voice card 4. Okay. Find that voice again. Sounds a little off. There we go. Okay. All right. There we go. Now we're perfect. We'll go back to oscillator 1. Okay. Next we'll do the Vca offset. Of course, once again, many ways to do this. My favorite way is like, once again, just to do it by ear. What I'll do is I will turn on the voice that I'm listening for, enable that voice. I'll turn off the oscillators, so all I'm going to hear is the offset, a little pop when the VCA is triggered. Okay, and then what I like to do is I like to crank up my monitor source. So I'm recording here for this video, and I am going to crank the input level so you guys can hear it over YouTube. And I'm also going to crank up the monitor level through my headphones, okay? So here we go, voice 1. You could use the oscilloscope as well, and just look for the offset, zoom in and look for the offset. You could use a little bit of averaging on a multimeter and try to dial it into 0 volts, but the air, in my opinion, is the fastest and best method. Okay, so now we're going to go with the second voice. Okay, and then go with the third voice. That second voice is borderline. I might actually replace that OTA, that VCA, for that voice. This one's pretty much dead center. Okay. And the last voice. So there's many ways to calibrate the filter, which we'll do last. Frequency minimum, resonance maximum. Turn off the oscillators. We want to hear the resonant peaks against the noise, against the random noise. Enable keyboard tracking. Okay. I'm going to enable voice 1. One other thing to note. Before adjusting the filter cutoff, you're going to want to make sure that if you have a filter control board installed, you're going to want to make sure that it's in the position where it's disabling filter mode selection and enabling noise selection. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to actually enable the full noise. So you want to make sure these switches are in the down position so that you can actually get full noise, which you're going to use together with resonance to actually tune the filters of each voice card. And what I like to do is use a 440 Hertz sine wave as a reference tone, and I like to tune the filter so that with no other modulations, when the cutoff frequency knob is at the minimum setting, I tune it to about 100 Hertz. And when the knob is at the maximum setting, which is 5 volts, it scans 0 to 5 volts. You get a 5-octave range. You don't get a complete range. So I like to tune it from about 100 Hertz to 200 Hertz, 400 Hertz, 800 Hertz, 1600, 3200. The way I like to do it is I can use an oscilloscope and I can use my ears. So the oscilloscope I set to 1 millisecond per division. I like to enable a bandwidth limit, filter out. Filter out some noise. Key D3. If I tune that to 440 at the initial tune, it'll give me the range I'm looking for. So I'm going to monitor, I'm going to hook up the ground and I'm going to monitor the output. I'm monitoring the right channel here. I'm listening to oscillator 1, and I'm going to adjust the initial frequency to match the tone. So basically it's going to be, let's see, 102, 4, it's basically going to be 880 hertz. So when I look on my scope and I filter it a little bit, there we go. There we go. I can see about one division is going to be about 880 hertz. So I can capture a measurement here and I can see that I'm at the right octave. So when you're at the right octave, setting the initial frequency at key D0, 1, 2, D3, key D0 is going to be 110 hertz roughly. So it'll be sort of the lowest audible octave you're going to hear. So that kind of gives you an idea of if you're setting the initial frequency at the right octave, because check this out. There's so much range. You got like 0, 1, 2, 3, you know, there's like 4 octaves range, so there we go, 880. Then I'm going to go down to D1 and I'm going to set the scale. Then I'll jump up to D4. Now, there's a cheap and dirty transistor expo for the filter, because it doesn't need to be as accurate as, say, an oscillator. So you're not going to get perfect, but you'll be surprised that you can actually tune these pretty good across a nice 3 or 4 octave range. There we go. So let's do voice number 2. Okay, we're getting pretty close here. Voice 3. Approximately 110 hertz. So we've got the right octave here. One more voice. Okay, now I can turn off that reference tone. And now I'm going to just step through the voices. So I'm going to enable all 4 voices. And I can listen to them all and match them all to each other. Pretty darn good. Okay, and then what I can do, just to double check that I've calibrated it to the right octave range, I'll go back, enable oscillator 1. I'm actually going to enable filter tracking so that when I play key C1, I get a little bump to the max frequency. And I'm actually going to sweep it. So we're 100 through a few K here. A little resonance. She can't quite get up to that top octave or that lowest octave. Okay, so you get a nice 5-octave range starting down at around 100 Hertz. Because the filter envelope only has positive modulation, so there's not really, aside from the LFO, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for negative modulation. So it's nice to be able to adjust the cutoff down to 100 Hertz. Then, if you have a filter envelope on your sound, it's going to be bumping up the filter anyway. And if you're not necessarily using the filter envelope, you'll always see people on the OBX sort of using the envelope modulation to sort of bump up the filter cutoff sum a little bit, especially if you've got the filter envelope sustain turned up and you're not really using much modulation. Say you got no attack, no decay, no release, you're just using the sustain. You effectively are increasing the cutoff. So say you're like, oh, I'm in unison. And you're not quite high enough. That resonance really does dirty up this machine, huh? Okay, so that's it. That's the last calibration. Now I'll cover one more thing, which is the voice motherboard calibration. It's very simple to adjust the trimmers for the output VCA for the left and right channel. Okay, so now I'm ready to calibrate the outputs on the voice motherboard. So we're going to plug in one channel at a time. So I'm going to monitor the left. I've got the left output plugged in right now, which is this side. I will generally leave the pan pots at the center position, and what you're going to do is you're going to make sure the volume is turned up to maximum. And you're going to hold down the auto tune button, listen for the thump or the clicking, and you're going to adjust the trimmer for the minimum audible noise. Okay, then I'm going to do the right channel, same thing. Okay, and that's it. Now we're done.